From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti will talk about assessing the condition of corn stands stressed by drought and heat before making decisions on whether or not to take that crop to grain. Also, K-State's Art Barnaby will offer his observations on the components of the 2018 Farm Bill with the House and Senate versions now in conference committee. He says that you producers should especially be interested in how the compromise version handles the update in crop base acres for program payment purposes. Today's Kansas Wheat Harvest Update features Extension Agricultural Agent Kyle Grant of Pawnee County. And K-State's Charlie Lee shares this week some background information on the Kangaroo Rat. All right here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Thanks for tuning in. You are listening to Agriculture Today. Well, as we step back and take a look at the progress and state of our corn stands in Kansas, there are some concerns and issues out there with the advanced growth of the crop. Complicating that, the drought stress and the heat. What does all of that mean collectively to the likely productivity of a corn stand? We'll dig into that right now with Ignacio Ciampitti, Mike Side once more, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension. You can't call it an ideal growing season so far for dryland corn, Ignacio. That's the flat fact of it.
Yeah, as always, Eric, thanks for the invitation.
You bet.
I think that we can call it, if you want to use a name, very abnormal. Some people might think, well, that's Kansas growing season.
Right.
And I would say it's very abnormal season. The concerns are very valid, and the concerns are depending where we're located in the state. If we look at the early planting corn, most of the corn that is located in central to eastern part of the state, that corn is the one that is under really conditions of drought and the heat. And this year, particularly, the heat was really hammering the corn and most of the summer row crops really early during the growing season.
In May, we had those high temperatures for that month.
Yeah, and then even if we compare to the previous growing season in the past, we haven't had this high temperature so early in the season. And one of the main effects to understand how high temperatures are impacting corn, the heat that was continuing all the first week of June, and I think that we have a figure that we put together in the e-update looking at the heat from June 11 to June 20. And the heat is a factor, but one of the most important relevant factors that we highlight on this article is the high night temperature. Right. And specifically, we highlight a few areas of the state, and we highlight the number of days where the night temperature was about 70 degrees, above 70. And then there were some areas in the southeast, south central, that we have numbers that were close to 10 degrees above. From that 11-day window that we analyzed for southeast and south central, there was an area of the state that we have 9 to 11 days.
No relief for the crop, basically.
No relief for the crop.
High-time temperatures.
Yeah, and using layman terms, corn likes the heat, but when it goes like high heat, when we go to days that they are above 96 or even above that numbers, it's too hot. Those plants, they start showing leaf rolling. This is a mechanism for the plant to avoid water loss. And then we start seeing that the plant basically is just staying in the field, not working, not doing much. What we don't get to realize is that basically that plant during the night, one of the most important functions is to basically reconstruct all the tissue that is damaged by heat. Okay, but The problem is that if we have high temperature, that plant will never tend to fully recover.
That's not happening, at least to the normal pace.
Yes, and most of the carbon that was fixed, that we can probably say, okay, that it will be a carbon that will go for yields, is just basically wasted. On the plant to try to recover during the night. These high temperatures are things that basically are not helping the corn plants to really fully recover. And then if you add to that the stress that we are having also for drought in some situations, and if you put into the combo, if you want, the phenology. What is the phenology? Is what is the stage of the crop?
It's well advanced this year, isn't it?
This year is really advanced, and we probably can blame the heat. Mm-hmm. In many locations, just to give you an example, one of the fields that I visited in Riley County, we were close to 2 weeks in advance as compared with previous years. Usually we have flowering around the first week of July. This year we have our first flowers. For corn, they were starting around June 24th. So if we don't get some rains, and looking at this temperature, even with the rain will help, but it's not sufficient because corn at this moment is at the peak of water use. When you look at a corn that is around flowering time, so we are discussing of 2.5 inches of water per week. So when you're looking at those demands and looking at the rain that we are having, we have in the last week, you might say, okay, we are in a good shape. When you start looking at the forecast for the next 10 days, then is when it starts to getting a little bit scary.
Ignacio, with the heat, with the dryness in several locations, has irreparable damage been done to that corn stand's productivity?
And I would say still will be early to tell for different reasons. For one, yes, some damage for sure, and we might only be able to see that damage. Before flowering, that plant starts defining the total number of kernels and the final maximum attainable kernels. So if there is a heat stress at that specific moment, and if you combine with drought, then for sure we will be losing in terms of attainable number of kernels. But the next 15 days after flowering are the critical ones to fix the kernels. Pollination went through in some fields, but the question right now is, if I pollinated 600 flowers and now they will become 600 kernels, can I retain those 600 kernels? I have seen situations that I don't want to repeat, of corn losing 50% of those kernels.
That's to be determined, though, right?
Exactly. So the conditions that will come from corn that is today or last week at flowering, conditions from the next 15 days, 20 days, will determine what it will be the final attainable number of kernels. And that will be one of the main components defining the yields. In the eastern part, central part, corn that is reaching or at flowering or passing flowering, some of the corn that is truly advanced on southeast is getting into grain filling. And then if you start looking at corn that is on the western side, I think that corn is still in a much better shape, but still is not yet to be defined because that corn is quite delayed. Some of that corn is still B6, before B6, or the most advanced that I have seen is around B9. But the conditions for that early season corn stands are much better than some of the conditions on the eastern side.
There will be some places in Kansas then where we will witness early corn harvest. Picking will start maybe in August or so. That seems to be in the cards, not widespread, but at isolated points.
Yeah, and if you look at my previous comment that some of the plots in some locations, we are entering already passing flowering. And most of the times we always recall flowering around the first week of July or around July 9. So today we are already 10 days, 15 days in advance in some locations. So, and that it was because we did accumulate more heat and the plant moved really fast. Consequences are, we might don't see much of those consequences, but when you start looking at those plants, they tend to be short plants, or if they are not too short, they tend to have less number of leaves. So stress of pollination, as I'm always mentioning, is this 15 days before, 15 days after is extremely critical. Defining the potential number of kernels or defining what will be the final number of kernels. And then from that point until harvest, we will start defining the weight of those kernels. And yes, answering those questions, I think that we will be seeing some combines that they will be rolling probably by early mid-August in some locations.
And taking all of this and considering it, then it really does mean that expectations for yields might have to be pared back a bit because of all of these atypical conditions and detriments to the crop.
Yeah, I'm still trying to be always cautious because it's very unpredictable.
All right.
And if you look at the conditions, I mean, if in the next 2 weeks we start receiving lower temperatures and rain, maybe we will be seeing one of the largest corn production in the history. And then we will get back to this radio piece and then we'll...
And reverse course, yes.
Of course. But the corn is still having, depending on the locations across the state, time and yield is still to be defined. What I cautious farmers are to go out to look at your corn. We have a lot of variability in terms of planting time and conditions. If your corn is under stress conditions, this is one of the moments that we need to start looking at decisions in terms of what to do with that corn. Should I, if the corn is under stress, should I cut for silage? Should I basically use it for hay or basically leave it for residue? Wait until pollination. Always too early to tell before. Because we want to make sure that we have a good idea how pollination went, what is the number of ears that we have in the field, and what is the attainable number of kernels. From that, we can have a good yield estimate.
Make a full assessment before you act. That's what you're saying.
Always make a full assessment before you act.
Well, Ignacio has been good to update folks through the e-update newsletter posted weekly by the Agronomy Department on our dryland corn stands in Kansas, which are under a bit of duress for various reasons around the state. Check out that information as it comes along at agronomy.ksu.edu. Well, in a couple of weeks or so, we'll have you back, Ignacio, and see where we stand with corn and or our other row crops around Kansas. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric. And yes, in a couple of weeks, I would say probably around in 10 days, we will start releasing the first predictions of corn yield for this year.
Excellent. He is Ignacio Ciampitti, Crop Production Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today will return in a moment on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is Agriculture Today. Well, with the U.S. Senate passing its version last week, the 2018 Farm Bill is one step closer to completion. However, significant work remains in the Conference Committee as the House and Senate seek out the compromise bill that will be returned to each chamber for a final vote and then on to the White House for the President's approval. K-State Agricultural Risk Management Specialist Art Barnaby notes that there are a few subtle nuances of this process that ought to be watched carefully. He spoke with the K-State Radio Network's Richard Baker about those, saying that in regard to the commodity title of the bill, there's still a stretch of time to get all that locked down.
They need to be done by roughly the 1st of December in order to have sign-up in the spring. The reason for that, and that's a really short time period, because you got to leave time for the Farm Services Agency to actually write the rules to implement this new program, and also to update their software to take enrollment because there are changes to this program from the previous one.
Now, there is planting in the fall. This is not going to have any impact on that, you think?
Well, winter wheat growers are kind of used to signing up after the crop's planted. And I'm fairly comfortable betting that's going to happen again, that we will be signing up after the winter wheat crop is planted. I actually see that as an advantage. I get to look at the wheat crop. I get to look at the market. It's only 1 year out of 5 because it's going to be a 5-year sign-up again like it was before, and you're locked in for 5 years. But at least you kind of know where the first year is going to look at. And that often influences what people do. And sometimes you may give you the wrong decision. But nonetheless, you do have more information by the time you get to April on what this year's wheat crop looks like and what this year's market looks like.
How different are the Senate and House versions? Tell me about crop insurance. What are the differences there?
Very little. That's the easiest one to answer. It basically was left intact. So, and the other thing is crop insurance is permanent legislation. You don't have to, if you don't pass anything, it definitely stays right where it's at. There are a few minor changes. I'm not even sure what they were, but they were so minor that they really don't matter. In fact, there were probably improvements for a few people. But for the most part, that is intact. There are no, while it was discussed, there are no limits on adjusted gross income. There's no limits on farm size, et cetera. That, based on our research, is actually something that could be very detrimental to crop insurance if you put those limits in. And the issue there is it's not like a regular commodity program. In a regular commodity program, if you're eligible to collect, even if you were eligible to collect, say, $200,000, but you only collect $125 because you hit the payment limit, you don't get the full payment, but you still get $125, so you're going to take it. With crop insurance, if I'm going to stop paying you at $125 and I have $200,000 worth of coverage, but I'm only going to pay you a maximum $125, I'm not going to buy it from you for, to cover $200. So that means you may well lose some of your best customers out of the pool, your least risky customers, and as a result, that impacts the pool itself. In fact, that's what we show. Bigger farmers actually have lower risk. Now it's confirmed by a study out of Mississippi, a much larger study than ours. And those changes means that your insurance pool becomes more risky and you have to raise the rates on everybody left. With the commodity title, there are no premiums paid by producers. It's essentially a free program to producers. So it's not exactly this. There's some differences in those two programs that make applying payment limits and size limits and all those sort of things to crop insurance, you're going to get different results than probably what you expect.
Okay, let's talk about the commodity program. And first of all, what are the differences between the Senate and the House?
Well, the first one that I was writing about was the possibility of losing base acres. Little history lesson. Back in 1996, we had a situation where in order to get the government commodity program payment, you had to actually plant wheat to get a wheat payment. And we had way too much wheat. The price was in the tank, didn't need more wheat. And this was pushed by Senator Roberts. The Freedom to Farm Act came about, which simply allowed farmers to plant any crop they wanted to. They did exclude fruits and vegetables. You couldn't plant fruits and vegetables, but you could plant anything you wanted to on those base acres, and you would receive payments. For example, you could plant sunflowers on wheat base. You would harvest the sunflowers and sell them as an oilseed, but you would receive a wheat payment. You would not receive a payment based on what happened to sunflowers. It would be strictly on the wheat. Well, 20 years later, a little more than 20 years later, everybody's forgot why we have freedom to farm. And so then the story came out with Thune Brown. These are two senators, one from South Dakota, the other from Ohio, who came up with the idea that we should require a base update. Now, we had the option to update your base in 2014. That was strictly up to the farmer, but this would be a required update. What that would do is people that were growing sunflowers on that wheat base would get their base shifted to sunflowers. Now, they could have done that in 2014. So I assume they didn't change to sunflowers because they didn't really want to change to sunflowers. That's why they stayed where they're at. That would have been really disruptive, and there would have been substantial base acres lost. And where they would have lost base acres is if they were planting a non-program crop. For example, I'm growing alfalfa on corn base. And if I were required to have a base update, I no longer have corn planted there, so I no longer have a base. It's gone. That didn't fly too far But then they came up with a variation of that you had to plant a program crop. So you could keep your base if you, say, planted sorghum on that corn base, because it is a program crop. So you're planting sorghum on a corn base, well, you'd still keep your base, and it wouldn't change at all. It would remain as a corn base. But if you planted alfalfa on there, you lost it. That didn't go too far, and Mr. Roberts, at a meeting just east of Manhattan here a month or so ago, flat out stated nobody's going to lose base. Well, that's true in the Senate version, but the House version, they didn't go as far as Thune Brown wanted to go to, but there's still a provision in there that from 2009 through 2017, during that period of time, so it's already history, you can't change anything, you had to plant a program crop on at least, I think it's an acre. It's not very much. You just have to have a program crop planted. So there are a few people under the House version that would lose base. Here's who they are. If during that period of time that you moved all of your acres, all your crop acres to brome grass, alfalfa, triticale, forages that you're using for livestock and for hay, all your acres were planted to that, you would lose your base under the House version. Now, if you planted any of it during that period of time to wheat, you're okay. So if I planted wheat for grazing rather than planting triticale, I'm okay. I get to keep my base. But if I planted triticale and non-program crops on those acres, and again, it's all acres, so there are a few people who have switched acreage from crop ground to brome grass, triticale, other things for livestock feed. Now, and as I said, had they planted wheat or oats as hay and forage for the livestock to graze or hay, they'd be okay because those are program crops. But if they did any of those other crops, it's gone. So there are a few people that would lose base. I don't think it's a very big number, but if it's your base, you probably don't see it that way. And so I don't know which version will prevail. The Senate version does nothing to the base. The House does a little bit. Now, this is not over. This is going to come back in this will be right back on front burner in 5 years, I guarantee you. It'll be back. So if they don't make the change now, in the next 5 years, you kind of betting on what they're going to do, but you may want to mix a few oats and wheat in that forage mix just as a safety mix, if you will.
So what other provisions in the two measures clash?
Well, the Senate version, they want to get rid or they want to lower the adjusted gross income from $900,000 to $700,000. The House version doesn't make any change there. So, again, if you're over the $700,000 limit, you will lose your government payments from the Farm Service Agency. Now, it doesn't affect your crop insurance at this point, but it does affect your Farm Service Agency payments. At this point, that will obviously catch a few more people, but I think the thing people ought to think about, it's the trend. It keeps going down. They've never raised it. So at some point, it gets low enough that they've made the commodity title irrelevant. And that's probably how we get out of how we actually eliminate government support payments for agriculture, incrementally lowering the AGI.
K-State Risk Management Specialist Art Barnaby there talking 2018 Farm Bill with the K-State Radio Network's Richard Baker. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This Agriculture Today continues now with another briefing on wheat harvest progress in Kansas, and this time Pawnee County toward the south-central southwest part of the state in the Larned area, where Kyle Grant is the Extension Agricultural Agent. Kyle, how much progress has been made? Have your producers cut out quite a bit of the crop in Pawnee County to this point?
I would say we are 70 to 80% done, give or take. It's been slow with the rains. We've had hit-and-miss rains. We've had some rains that weren't even in the forecast that snuck up on us. It's made it a challenge. And the stuff that was coming to the elevators, first of all, the test weights and stuff were good, and the yields weren't bad. And now since the rain, the test weights fell out a little bit, and the yields have went down. The big problem right now is grass coming in, pigweeds coming in, just trying to get through that kind of stuff.
So prior to the rain delays and the subsequent impact on the crop, what sorts of yields and test weights were your farmers reaping?
We were seeing test weights over 60, yields probably 40 plus, give or take. Right now we're seeing some yields 30, 35 and under.
So it has taken a bit of a toll, it sounds.
Yes.
Ahead of harvest, what were the general expectations? We've talked before with other counties and other agents about, in particularly western Kansas, the bar was set fairly low. What was the thinking in Pawnee County going in?
I wouldn't say we set them low. I'd say we probably set them average. And driving around, the wheat that's still out there, you can tell. I mean, you drive around and you can see there's some thin wheat out there, some short wheat.
And now, with the weed growth, it's going to make it that much more difficult to cleanly bring that last 10-15% of the crop in the county in.
Yes, and I don't care what color you have, machinery-wise, but no combines like green weeds. Right.
You say, Kyle, have some numbers from your test plots on variety performance.
Yes. We had 15 varieties in our plot, and it was cut Tuesday, June 19th. Larry was the best. It was 11.7 moisture. Test weight was 57.8, and the bushels were 84.73. Another variety that stood out was Tatanka. Moisture was 11.8. Test weight was 56.7, and 81.94 bushels. Another one that stood out was the Double Stop CL. Moisture was 11.8, 60-pound test weight, and it was 80.89 bushels.
Keeping in mind these are test plots now. Those are high yield numbers that probably will not be reflected regularly in a full field situation, but they give an indicator of how those varieties might do over time.
Correct.
So it's not been the greatest of wheat years in Pawnee County, but what are your farmers thinking? It could have been worse, or just moving on to the next thing? What?
Moving on to a better year. Right now we're getting rain, and it's hard for farmers to get started. You know, you have to worry about moisture and then the dew coming up at night. It's hard to get started, and then when you get started, you know, there's a shower here and there, which I'm not complaining about the rain because we need it for the fall crops, but it was hard to get rain last fall through the winter. We had snow, but didn't get much moisture out of the snow, so we just need some moisture. Hopefully we're not planting in next year and do powder dry and stirring up the countryside.
Well, Kyle, thank you for the quick word on harvest in Pawnee County, and hopefully your producers can knock out those last few acres in relatively short order. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir.
That's Kyle Grant. He is the Extension Agricultural Agent in Pawnee County. Next up, milk lines with K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning somatic cell counts in our dairy herds as we move through summer. One of the things that we often look at during the summer in our dairy herds is where we go with level of somatic cell. You know, it's been amazing over the last 10 years how we've lowered the average somatic cell count on our dairy farms across Kansas and really across the United States. However, summertime still tends to be a challenge, so what's the basic thing that we're really fighting? Well, there's really two things that we seem to fight more in the summer. Number one is just exposure to bacteria. Weather's warmer, so bacteria multiply quicker, so that helps them naturally. Keep in mind that infections of the udder all start with bacteria making its way into the udder through the teat canal. So exposure really is, when we talk about that, it's bacterial exposure at the teat end is what we're really trying to minimize. So in the summertime, as animals get stressed, their immune system and immune function tends to decrease. We also have this extra growth of bacteria that is potential. We also have things like flies that are around, and again, those spread bacteria to teat ends if that's where they decide to land, and in some cases feed. We've got some interesting things that can happen there just due to that. So when you count into the fact that a cow that is heat stressed is going to be looking for a wet place to lay down, well, now you have more bacteria that might get to the teat end. So you can see we have some added challenges during the summertime when it comes to just trying to keep bacteria away from the teat ends of our dairy cattle. So what are some practical things that we can do on our dairy farm to try to reduce somatic cell count, or at least minimize the effect of summer on somatic cell count in our herd? Well, one of the first things you really need to think about is fact that the cows are going to be laying, so where are they going to be laying, and how can we keep those areas as clean as possible? So for in freestall barns, stall maintenance becomes important in making sure that we keep manure and urine out of the backs of those stalls to try to reduce the overall bacteria load that might be exposed to the animal. If we have animals that are out on pasture, again, keeping them away from water and wet areas becomes a primary way of, again, reducing the potential for bacteria load at the teat end. Some other things we might think about in the milking parlor, making sure that we're still doing a good job with applying pre-dip and also cleaning the animals prior to milking. And then finally, just making sure that we have an effective post-dip that we're using after the cows are milked. One final thing that you might want to think about, it's really important that after milking that cows continue to stand for about another 30 minutes. So making sure that we offer fresh feed after milking to encourage them to stand and eat for a while before they go and lay down. It's another major way we can reduce the potential for bacteria load at that teat end while it is still open and allowing bacteria to get into the inside of the udder. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to do what we can do to minimize the exposure of bacteria to our dairy cows this summer.
Thanks, Mike, as always, and this is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today is back now, and we're visiting once again with wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, we're going to revisit a rodent that's found in the western part of the state by and large, and it is distinctly different from other rodents, the kangaroo rat. Very interesting critter.
Well, the Ord's kangaroo rat is somewhat common in Kansas. It's found in the western part of the state, basically from Salina westward. It's not actually a rat or a mouse, although it is a rodent. Its probably closest relative would be a pocket gopher. But it would be a heavy-bodied rodent, somewhat smaller than what normally people would think a rat would be. It has a very short neck, a large head. The tail is longer than the combined length of the head and the body. The tail ends in a tuft. The front feet are very much smaller than the rear feet. It has cheek pouches that it uses to store and carry grain. And the name probably arrives from its habit of using its back feet to hop across the ground. The tail is often drug along, and it acts somewhat like a very miniature kangaroo in its movements.
And it's quite well adapted to our climate and conditions in the high plains?
Has a lot of structural adaptations that makes it fit in the western part of the state. Many people would think that it's purely a desert animal, but it is found in locations that you wouldn't classify as desert, sand desert, but it does like sandy-type soils. Some of those adaptations are certainly have allowed them to thrive over time. Part of them is that they're very good at avoiding predators. They have very broad skulls with large bony structures that surround the inner ear, which gives them extremely sensitive hearing. They can actually hear owls and snakes approaching, which is a very heightened sense compared to many rodents. They also have very large eyes. That's primarily because they're nocturnal and they need to be able to see in the dark as they're foraging for seeds. Then they have those large cheek pouches that are lined with fur where they can store a number of seeds before they have to return to those burrows. Despite living in very hot conditions and being active in desert regions, kangaroo rats don't sweat. They have very oily coats, and both of those adaptations prevent the kangaroo rats from losing water. Without sweat, they're less able to cool their bodies, so they use their small front legs to dig burrows underground. Then they modify the temperature and humidity in those burrows by opening and closing the entrance to that burrow. So they modify, just like you're changing the temperature in a room, kangaroo rats do something very similar in their burrows. They're found in colonies, so there will be a small area that will have a fairly high density of kangaroo rats, and then maybe a big span before you find another colony.
So it's a pretty industrious rodent, and fending off rattlesnakes in particular. They have some ability that most other prey don't.
Well, they do a good job of interacting with rattlesnakes. They have a foot drum, or it's a bout of a repeated drumming of the hind feet. That's a signaling mechanism, perhaps for the other rodents within that colony to let them know when a predator is near. Then they have what's called a rapid drumming, or a foot roll, with both hind feet at the same time. We mentioned their jump. They also have a jump back. It's a jumping motion in which the kangaroo rat first approaches the snake and then rapidly jumps in the air away from the snake. And then they also have a sand kick, where they use the hind feet to kick sand or substrate towards the snake. Those mechanisms seem to serve that very well, because rattlesnakes, although are found and often inhabiting kangaroo rat burrows, or particularly those that have been opened, aren't very efficient at capturing kangaroo rats. Some research has shown that rattlesnake strike success in the wild is typically less than 50%, with most of those missed strikes being attributed to animals that were very elusive. And the kangaroo rat certainly beats that by a great margin. They're actually much faster than a rattlesnake strike. So rattlesnakes typically, although they would prey on kangaroo rats, are not very successful at capturing them.
So the kangaroo rat is, in a sense, resilient to a number of problems it might run across. But is it a nuisance species? Does it cause any damage agriculturally or otherwise?
Well, most of the time when we are concerned about rodents causing damage, it's what they eat. And it would be the same for kangaroo rats. They're going to feed on seeds, mostly seeds of native plants, particularly weedy-type plants. Buds, tubers, or even green leaves are eaten, as are occasionally insects. But the problem with kangaroo rats that I hear about from crop producers is right after a crop is planted. Before the newly planted crop emerges in areas with kangaroo rat colonies, the kangaroo rat, with having a good sensitive nose and the ability to dig shallow distances, will go down the row and dig up and consume seeds. Then, in that area that's occupied by the kangaroo rat colony, you have very low plant population, so your yield potential is very low in that area. So they can cause problems, but fortunately they're not widely distributed across the field. in the small areas in which those colonies are found, you can have very low plant populations, but when you consider it in the context of the entire field, perhaps it's not as significant as many people would think.
So once again, here we have a species that largely can be appreciated, although maybe not seen readily. You say it's nocturnal.
It's nocturnal, but it is observed quite readily by people driving around. It's very common to see kangaroo rats run across or hop across the road in the western part of the state. If you're going to observe kangaroo rats, you're going to have to be somewhat of a night watchman.
Well, once again, it can be found with some frequency in the western half of the state, roughly, and maybe some points beyond. That is the kangaroo rat, a unique rodent indeed. Charlie, we appreciate the word. Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Well, our time's away for today. The Kansas State University campus will be closed tomorrow for Independence Day, so we'll be away as well. Please rejoin us on Thursday, won't you? In the meantime, a happy and safe 4th to you and yours. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.